So our last Q&A of the semester. So some good questions this week. Starting out, given Trump's willingness to tolerate authoritarian activity, essentially straying away from the U.S. role as a policing nation, how did this affect U.S. North Korean relations? So the most obvious was his decision to hold the summit with the North Korean leader Kim in Singapore in 2018, and traditionally the U.S. approach to the to the North Korean government, and this dated back 30 years or so, was to basically hold out any kind of diplomatic contact between the United States and North Korea as the ultimate carrot, the incentive for the North Koreans to behave more appropriately with regards to nuclear proliferation. And there never was any even the remotest of remote thoughts of a president meeting with Kim. Trump met with Kim without getting basically anything out of the deal. He did it largely for mostly it seemed like for domestic political reasons. He'd been talking with or tweeting at Kim on his Twitter feed. Excuse me. There really was no rational policy decision for the move. Now, one of the things I think that may be worth debating, you could make a case. Look, maybe the North Korean situation would have been even worse with a more confrontational approach. It's certainly true that neither W. Bush nor Obama was able to do much with the North Koreans, but I think what differentiated Trump in a negative way with regards to North Korea is that it essentially elevated the North Korean regime standing on the international stage. I mean, they got a summit with a U.S. leader, something that was unprecedented, and the U.S. got just zero out of this. So in effect, the U.S. made a major concession, and the North Koreans didn't have to make any concessions at all. And I think in terms of an argument for diplomatic recklessness by Trump, the handling of North Korean matters would be really right up there, and as a good example. So a couple of questions related to Trump. Why did he win the election? Is it possible he's going to win again? How did the kind of economic nationalism with regards to trade affect his policy? With regards to trade, Trump really is unusual in the sort of the span of U.S. presidents, certainly after World War II. There had been a bipartisan consensus beginning with FDR that lower tariffs were good for the United States economically, and also were useful diplomatically. That is, that providing other countries with enhanced access to the U.S. market in terms of trade would help the U.S. diplomatically. Trump clearly did not believe that, believe that other countries were taking advantage of the U.S., raised tariffs with the Chinese, got into, trade wars with various other countries. I mean, he had a trade war with Canada for a good portion of his presidency. It is, I think, very, very unclear, to put it mildly, that this did anything good in terms of U.S. foreign policy. So I do think, in response to the second question, that this was a big deal. That this is an area where Trump's policy really was very, very different from what we had seen from presidents of either party over the last, say, 50 years. In terms of what the main reason that he won the election, I do think that issues on trade and immigration Likely were decisive. I mean, he won 2016 in it was such a narrow margin, you could point to anything. But to me, the critical aspect of Trump's win in 2016 were these significant numbers of so-called Obama Trump voters in the upper Midwest in states like Iowa or Wisconsin or Michigan or Pennsylvania. People who had voted for Obama in 2008, who voted for Obama in 2012, but who then changed their minds and voted for Trump in 2016 rather than Hillary. And one of the reasons for this the switch of this electorate was that Trump was speaking to their concerns about trade and immigration in a way that Clinton was just completely not. And so I do think that these issues provided an opening to Trump, to a critical group that he otherwise would not have had access to. In terms of, is it possible that he'll win the next presidential election? Yeah, I mean this is from 538, the ABC News polling site. So Trump's favorable unfavorable rating is around 54 unfavorable, around 41 favorable, and you say, well, gee, that doesn't look very good. It's not. But contrast to what it was just in the aftermath of when he left office, where his unfavorables were in the high 50s, and this span, roughly 54 unfavorable, roughly 41 favorable, that's basically where he was as president, and that's very, very similar to the favorable rating for Biden. I don't think that Trump ultimately is even going to run in 3 years. But if he does, and if Biden's standing is sort of where it is now, or if the Democrats nominate Kamala Harris, who polls even lower than Biden does, I mean, it's certainly not inconceivable that Trump could prevail, although I don't think he is by any means the strongest candidate the Republicans could nominate in 2024. Question about it's a good question. Where these small countries like Syria are getting their hands on chemical weapons, especially if other countries feared having these weapons. Are they producing them, or are other countries dealing with them? And the answer to this is a little bit of both. The Syrians were aggressive in terms of searching for these weapons, but it's also true that since the 1990s, and especially in the last 12, 15 years, the Iranian government has been extremely aggressive at outreach to Syria, to Hezbollah in Lebanon, to Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And in facilitating access to the sorts of things that the Syrians wanted. And so, the answer to this question is partly Syria is getting this from and Iraq before them, getting it from patron states, but also some of the European countries, the French, the Germans, have really, really poor records about aggressively sanctioning and restricting trade to countries in the Middle East who are attempting to develop weapons of mass destruction. This was a big issue in terms of the Iraqi nuclear program, and then later on the Iraqi chemical weapons program. So I think the Syria example it's a kind of sad story that the countries that are committed to developing a chemical weapons stockpile and using it against their own citizens are almost certainly going to be able to find the weapons, despite international norms and in some areas treaties that restrict the development of chemical weapons. And then the last set of questions deal with Trump in the Middle East. So how much credit should Trump personally be given as far as the Abraham Accords, considering he maintains a brokered peace in the Middle East? And then a related question of why do Democrats and liberal Democrats, especially liberal Democrats, become more sympathetic towards Palestinians after the Netanyahu address? On the first question, it's true that Trump oversold what he was doing in the Middle East as he, this was it's a kind of Trumpian approach. He sort of oversold everything. That said, I do think that this is one of the very few clear accomplishments of his administration. In effect, what the Trump people did, and they certainly don't have clean hands on this. There was a report in the New York Times a few days ago that Jared Kushner is now soliciting funds in the Middle East for a big investment fund. Um, but the key insight that Trump or that the people around Trump had, and it seems like this was mostly an initiative of Kushner, was that in the aftermath of the U.S.-Iran nuclear deal in 2015, which really freaked out the government of Israel, but also the Sunni states in the Gulf, that countries like the United Arab Emirates or Bahrain, or even to a certain extent Saudi Arabia, because it's unlikely that the UAE would have done a diplomatic deal with Israel absent Saudi approval, basically had tired of the Palestinians, and their previous policy had been, look, we're not going to do any peace with Israel until Israel and the Palestinians do peace. But the fact that the Palestinian leadership didn't seem terribly eager to engage in meaningful peace discussions with the Israelis seems to have led the Arab states to basically lose patience. And the Trump people seem to have recognized this, and in the process abandoned the what had been a bipartisan consensus, which was that peace between Israel and the Arab world could not occur until there was a U.S. An Israeli-Palestinian peace. And one of the things we've seen is that the Abraham Accords have proven not just lasting, but that they've grown in strength over the last year, despite basically being greeted indifferently by the Biden administration. The most recent example came late last month when Benny Gantz, who's the current defense secretary of Israel, traveled to Morocco, an Arab state, signed a memorandum of understanding on defense issues with Morocco. There's going to be military cooperation, military sales between Israel and Morocco. Israel might have a base in Morocco. There's been similar, not just military, but also cultural and economic cooperation between Israel and the UAE. And none of these deals would have occurred but for sweeteners that the Trump administration had offered to these Arab countries to make the deal. So this is, I think, actually a concrete accomplishment to which Trump could point. And I mean, in the diplomatic realm, it's really one of the few clear accomplishments of his administration. With regards to the polling, so this is from Pew. This is from 2018, where the shift first became clear, and it has remained in the place. So take a look down here at the bottom right. So this is liberal Democrats, who generally had been more sympathetic to Israel than to the Palestinians until basically when Trump took office, and then we see this enormous shift, sympathy for Israel dropping down, and sympathy for the Palestinians rising, and it's close to a 2-to-1 majority now. And I think there are a number of different things that are playing a role here. Part of it, it seems to me, is Netanyahu, which is that Netanyahu during the Obama administration seemed eager to politicize the U.S.-Israeli relationship. He continued this under Trump. He really kind of played up to Trump. And so to the extent he was associating Israel with the Republican Party, it's not terribly surprising that Democrats responded negatively. And to me, this is the strongest critique of Netanyahu's national security policies, is that when you are the weaker partner in a diplomatic arrangement, and Israel is the weaker partner in the U.S.-Israeli alliance, you have to make sure that you accommodate all forces within the patron state, and Netanyahu seemed to lose interest in that. So I think that this was part of the reason. I think there are other more broader ideological changes within the Democratic Party as a whole. You see a lot of liberal Democrats who associate Israel with being the oppressor state in the relationship. So they don't see this as an Israeli-Arab issue. They see it as an Israeli-Palestinian issue, and then I think there's just some there's some hostility to the Israeli state among the contemporary American left, and it seems to me all of these things kind of came together to drive down support for Israel. Now, Israel currently has a new government. It's a broad-ranging coalition that moves from right to left. It includes, for the first time since the 1970s, an Israeli Arab party as part of the coalition. There hasn't been polling since the installation of the new government about American sympathies towards Israel, but anecdotally, it doesn't seem as if there's been much of a change with regards to these attitudes, even though Netanyahu has sort of dropped out of office. And the other thing that's worth looking at from these figures, I mean, take a look at the Republican surge in support for Israel. So there never had been much sympathy with for the Palestinians among Republicans, but what we've seen is this enormous surge in sympathy for Israel among Republicans, especially among conservative Republicans. And so it seems like it's almost everything in American politics in the last 5 or 6 years has become politicized, and we're seeing that in terms of attitudes towards Israel as well. All right, so that's all we have for the Q&A for this week.